Hello, everyone. In today's interview with Cole, we're going to discuss data storytelling for the next generation and chatting with Cole about her latest book for this demographic, which is Daphne Draws Data. So this is a good time to tag a friend or share this with a colleague, a fellow parent or educator so that they can listen to this as well. For those of you who are new, my name is Hannah, and I'm the host of the Art of Communicating Data show, which is what you're listening to right now. I go live to record these interviews for my podcast. When you join live, you get to ask your questions and get the help you need with your data communication journey. So feel free to pop your questions in the chat at any time. And now I want to welcome our guest, Cole Nussbaumer Knaflic. You likely already know her because she's the best-selling author of Storytelling with Data and now the author of Daphne Draws Data, which is going to be released next week. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So welcome, Cole, and congrats on the new book.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks so much.
Can you tell us a little bit about how this all got started? Like what inspired you to write a children's book about data?
Well, it started, I think, when I started having kids, right? So my background is communicating to adults and writing business books for grown-ups. But I think ever having kids of my own, which has started almost 12 years ago now, I had this sort of gnawing idea at the back of my mind as you watch their brains develop and see them learn language, how to speak and listen and ask questions and read and write, that it really seemed like we could be teaching the visual language of graphs a lot sooner than we typically do. And so I knew for a long time that I wanted to do something aimed at the younger audience. I didn't know what it looked like though. And it took a lot of random ideas when I'd have some downtime in a notebook and sketching out different things and trying different things. And I ended up writing a lot before getting on the path that led to Daphne.
That's great. I mean, you talked about how you were considering this and introducing this visual language of data early on. While you were writing this book, are there any hidden pitfalls with introducing data concepts or this visual language to children that you had to overcome?
I think one, I wouldn't call it a pitfall, but a constraint that I overlooked early on and then came back to in a way that was helpful was just how brief you have to be, how concise, how few words, how few pictures and images you can have. I think of my last business book was something like 80,000 words. And so you can say pretty much everything you want to say when you have that many words in which to do it. But a traditional children's book is exactly 32 pages because of how it runs through the print machine. It should be less than 1,000 words, ideally quite a bit less than that. And so each word becomes really important. And you also, it's funny because this ends up being very similar to how you communicate with graphs and words together. But in a picture book, a lot of the story is told through the illustrations. So there's a balance in figuring out what do you actually put into words and what do you let children and adults experience as they're turning the pages.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know about the restrictions with the word limit and the pages. I didn't consider that, but that definitely makes sense for children's book now that I think about it. Have you noticed if there are any challenges with educators or parents when they are trying to teach this demographic about data literacy or data visualization that this book helps address?
So we haven't seen it in the wild much yet. Those are the success stories that I'm going to be looking to collect once it comes out next week. But I think another part of why the book ended up being what it is and why we're building so many resources around it online to help further kids thinking about asking questions and how they can use data to answer their questions is just my own experience of what had been coming home with my kids from math class or science. The rare occasions on which they do something with a graph, the graphs are really basic, which isn't a bad thing, but also not on things that are very compelling. So, for example,
Mm.
every year they come home with a bar chart where they've graphed the weather at some point. So, like the weather in January, right? The weather in January in Wisconsin isn't a very lovely thing, right? It's cold, there are a lot of
Right.
gray days, but the kids already experienced that. They don't need a
Mm.
graph to tell them that it's cold in winter in Wisconsin. And so I think as a result of that, and that's just one example, but they end up, math is taught in a very abstract way. The graphs they do see maybe
Mm.
aren't very interesting. And I fear that it turns a lot of kids off of numbers and graphs early, when really this is the time where we could be tapping into their innate curiosity. Because little kids ask so many questions. It's the way, or one of the ways that they learn about the world and learn about themselves. And if we could teach them how to look for information and collect information to empower them to answer their own questions, that could be a super amazing thing. And then they're going to care about the numbers and the graphs because these become tools that they can use in really powerful ways. And so, a lot of what I'm hoping Daphne does is make the process of collecting and analyzing numbers just easy and straightforward so that kids can then take that same idea and apply it to their own questions or the questions of their friends around them. I think as we see Daphne go through her journeys, everyone can hopefully see a little bit of themselves in her at some point along the way.
Yeah, I like the different examples you provided in the book where Daphne is, presented with these different situations and there's different ways that she's solving different people's problems and a variety of chart types. I won't give away too much, no spoilers, but I love that you gave these different examples because then people, or children especially, can relate to these different situations where they could see that, maybe data could help me or my friend or someone else I know solve their problem, which is really wonderful. You mentioned about how your prior books have been for grown-ups, for data professionals to learn about data viz, storytelling, and presenting with data. Has creating a children's book changed or influenced your perspective in any way on data storytelling for grown-ups?
I don't think it's changed anything because for me the fundamentals have been the same and will stay the same. It does
Mm.
definitely underscore how important it is to boil things down to as simple as they can be, but not simpler than that.
Mm.
And so it turns out a lot of the lessons that we teach grown-ups, they apply equally well in the kids space, just with different framing and maybe some different examples. And I think in the same way that once you learn the quote unquote rules when you're visualizing data as a grown up, you can start to play with them. And so Daphne has some fun with some of the graphs as well. One twist on a bar chart is she's graphing polar bears and how deep they dive. And so she graphs it in a bar chart, but it's a downward facing bar chart, so it's showing the depth that each has dove. And so just allowing there to be some fun and some play while still teaching the fundamentals and the basics, I think is something that maybe came through more in the Daphne space than it does in the adult space. But that has been fun. And I think I knew that I wanted the primary book to be a story and
Mm.
to be something that can just be enjoyable to read. And you get some really pictorial versions of graphs. But if you don't want to, you don't have to go any deeper, right? So you could read this at bedtime and not have to go into, explaining the intricacies of a scatter plot. However, for people who have older kids or kids who want to learn more, then there's the glossary at the end that provides examples, gives more detail about the different types of visuals when they're useful, examples that Daphne used, and then also gives some example activities that kids could use to collect their own data and make the given chart type.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about the how important the design is for children's book, and I've seen the version of it, electronic version of it, and for those who are listening, the illustrations are beautiful. You hired a very talented
Thank you.
illustrator. They're so
Sean's
beautiful.
amazing.
Yeah, children will love to look at this
And
book. Yeah.
I have the first copy right here. We're supposed to be getting more this week, but yeah, it's amazingly
Yeah.
bright and colorful, and it makes me happy.
Yeah, it's really nice. For those of you who just joined, feel free to pop your questions or any comments you have for Cole in the chat box, and I'll answer them. And so we're talking about data storytelling for the next generation, which are younger kids. And we're specifically talking about Cole's latest book that's coming out soon, Daphne Draws Data. So, we talked about so far about the pitfalls and challenges with communicating data viz and other data concepts for children, as well as your experience with teaching these concepts to both children and grown-ups. Um, Now I want to imagine if Daphne's all grown up and working as a data professional, because hopefully the job market is way better than it is now. What unique strengths do you think she would bring to the field because she's been introduced to these concepts at such a young age?
I love this question. I hadn't thought about who Daphne is going to be when she grows up. But I think because of the skills that she's already developed at her young age, right, and is teaching to others, that she's going to be a powerhouse in any type of role that she goes into. Because we already know today that data is being used pretty much everywhere. There are a ton of different industries and roles that historically were not very data driven, where you have people who are needing to understand how to interpret graphs, how to interpret numbers, how to communicate to others with numbers. And so when we can develop those skills at a young age, I think both the communication piece, but also really getting into the exploration side of things, of how do we form a good question? How do we know where to turn to collect information, or how to understand if what we've collected is going to be representative, if we can draw conclusions from it? How do we analyze that data? And then how do we put that all together in a way that's going to make sense to someone else, and in a way that's going to add value? It's going to solve someone's problem or help us have a better discussion. So you can imagine if Daphne's doing that at her young age and continues to hone and refine those skills, it means she's going to bring that forward into her career. AI is one of the topics that seems to come up in almost every conversation lately, but getting really good at answering questions or asking questions and knowing when to ask more questions and how to phrase those in a way to get back what you need is, I think it's already a critical skill, but it's going to be even more so given the direction that things are heading.
Right. Yeah, I can't imagine children who have been exposed to these concepts and these skills and practicing it for such a young age, like what a powerful professional they'll be once they're older. But yeah, it's a great thing to start to encourage children at such a young age. What I also liked about in your book is how a part of the story was like people really underestimated the importance of Daphne's data curiosity and the skill that comes with it. And actually, as a grown-up, I've seen other grown-ups also doubt the importance of such skills. And it's been funny to try to explain like how valuable that is. And I really think this story helps show that. So for those children that are interested in math and numbers and analysis or data viz, I think this is a great book to boost their confidence and
Yes.
hopefully encourage them to continue pursuing these skills.
Well, and to reframe that as a superpower and something that might be different, but different in an amazing way. I think one of the things that is sad to me, we talked a little bit earlier about kids, and they're always asking questions. And I think rather than teach them how to do that well, oftentimes maybe inadvertently, but they get shut down. And over time, they learn not to ask as many questions, which is a sad thing because, and actually, I heard a story the other day. I was talking with someone and they said, there was a little girl in one of the classes and she would always ask questions. She asked so many questions. And finally, the teacher said to her, you can only ask 2 questions per class because it's taking over too much. And it was like, what a missed opportunity, because that same teacher could have said something like, write down all of your questions. I know they're all super interesting, but see if you can prioritize them. What are the 2 most interesting questions on your list? Let's dive into those. And then now you've taught a skill of how do you kind of edit your own thought process and questions and start with the top priority ones, which is critical for anyone going into any sort of analytical role. And so if we can be teaching that when kids still have that natural curiosity and how they can use it in an even more useful way, I think that could be really powerful.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. An earlier guest on this show, we were talking about questions as well. And specifically, we noticed that the more senior role we got into in the data field, the more questions we asked and more
Yes.
confidence we got, because we realized it's so powerful to have to ask these questions and to learn more rather than make assumptions and not ask those questions and remain in ignorance. So, that's a really good point that you bring up.
Well, and you figure as someone moves up in an organization, they're going to be doing less of the sort of heavy lifting of any sort of analysis work or those sorts of things. And so then asking good questions becomes really important again to build confidence in the things that other people, the work that other people have done. And so that you know that you're making solid decisions based on that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. You also mentioned about, this evolving world we're living in, and with AI coming up, Daphne Draws Data is influencing this next generation of data professionals and storytellers. How do you see this field of data evolving in the coming years? And how do you think this book helps prepare children for that future?
Well, one of the things we talked about questions or something that we start out with a lot of, and that kind of gets maybe shut down sometimes over time. Something else that we tend to do a lot of when we're little that many people stop doing over time is just drawing and using paper and pencil or crayons. And I think as technology advances, we need to be doing more of that and not less. And so you'll notice Daphne, as she goes on her adventures, she doesn't have a laptop with her. She's not writing code. She is drawing with a tablet or like a paper tablet and her crayons. And there's something really nice about that because I think it reinforces the idea that sloppy is okay. It doesn't have to look perfect. It can be a little artsy, or it can be colorful, or it can be a little sloppy and go outside of the lines. But it's the thought process behind it that makes it useful. Because we know that even if a graph looks great, if the underlying data and thought process aren't there and are going to crumble, that actually gives a false sense of confidence in the information, which is not the direction that we want to take things in. So I, for one, hope that Daphne inspires people to get low tech when it comes to thinking about numbers visually and graphing and answering questions with graphs. So bring back the questions and the crayons, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I actually was inspired by Daphne to draw a chart.
Yay!
Using my tablet. So I kind of cheated because I'm trying to use my tablet more, and it is dangerous for me to have crayons around with a 2-year-old in the house.
Fair.
But I was inspired because I was looking at
Oh, look at that.
when you published your books, when you released them, and I was trying to figure out when is
Oh
the
my
next
goodness.
book coming out,
Yeah.
because you've been on quite a roll.
Yeah, the gap gets smaller every time.
Yeah, and so you published the workbook version of Storytelling with Data 4 years after Storytelling with Data, and then 3 years later you came out with Storytelling with You, and 2 years after that, which is now, you have Daphne Draws Data. So, assuming this pattern continues, I'm expecting another book soon, maybe.
I think you might be right here.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's no pressure, but that'd be great news for all of us. And if you're looking for sequel ideas, maybe Daphne gets an AI sidekick that helps her with her next data adventure.
It's funny because I remember after writing the first book, I thought, I've used all my words. I will never do this again. And like, now it's flipped the other way. I'll have words forever. I could keep writing forever.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome to hear. And, we were talking about asking questions. So we already have questions in the chat box.
Great.
Luis is asking, what's the target range for Daphne Draws Data?
Yeah, the target age is really 6 to 9-year-olds. I think third grade is the sweet spot when it comes to both the story and the graphing pieces, but it definitely stretches both younger and older.
Awesome. And for those who join late, we are talking about Daphne Draws Data, which is coming out next week on September 4th. And so if you're interested in pre-ordering, you can use the QR code that you see here on this flyer, or you can also go to daphnedrawsdata.com/order. You can pre-order your copy today. And yeah, this has been a really insightful and fun conversation. Thank you, folks, for joining in. I think this was really interesting to talk about educating the next generation on these important data topics in a fun way, as you mentioned. Like, I wish as grown-ups we could every day work with data in a fun and playful way, like children can, but they can with this book and the activities that you suggest as well. So thank you again, Cole, for coming on the show today, and for this very fun conversation. And congrats again on this new book. And
Thanks very much, Hannah.
Yeah.
I'll also just mention for folks tuned in to check out the website, daphnedrawsdata.com. There we have information on upcoming events with book readings in Milwaukee and Seattle. There are additional activities for kids, support for parents. So even if you don't consider yourself a data guru, there are things for you there to help your kids work through Daphne, and then also resources for educators. We will be continuing to add to that over time.
Yeah, I love that. I was checking out the resources, and you have put up a lot of stuff on that website, a lot of supporting materials on there. I think it was helpful for all types of people, for children who have these very curious children who have more questions. And if you're not sure about how to explain a certain concept to them, there's resources on there for that, as well as for educators, and some activity ideas as well. And my kid is too young for this book, so I'm going to let him enjoy the pictures for now, and then try to make sure he doesn't rip the pages when he's older. Read the book to him. I just really saying thank you. My second grader and I both listened in, and I appreciate you making this book. So yeah, thank you for that. And for those of you who are watching the replay or listening to this, I'll be sure to link in the show notes a link where you can pre-order the book or purchase the book depending on the date. It's a really wonderful book, and even if you don't have kids, this will make a great gift for a kid in your life, or reading it. You could be the favorite aunt or uncle reading this book, getting this book. Especially, Cole and I were talking before we started this live, is that we've probably at least once been asked by a young kid, like, what do you do for a living, and what exactly is data? What does that even mean? And I think this is a great resource to help you explain that.
I have had a couple early reviewers tell me, thank you, now I can explain what I do to my child.
Exactly. Although I know this book makes it seem a lot more adventurous than our actual workday. But we'll let them be hopeful, and also, romanticize our day job, which I don't mind doing. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. If you missed any part of this interview will be published on my podcast, The Art of Communicating Data Show. So you can catch the full replay there, hopefully by Wednesday. And yeah, thank you again so much, Cole, for coming on the show. And this was a really great chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah.